Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I am here with Jeffrey C. Pugh, and we are going to have some Bonhoeffer excitement today. Um,
Not just
really,
today.
no, not just today. Let's just do it till the rest of the year, Jeff.
Oh, God. All right.
Yeah. Um, so we have been working this past year on a whole kind of Bonhoeffer experience of sorts, where there's going to be an 8-part audio documentary series that um, is quite a fun, labor intensive endeavor, weaving together the story of Bonhoeffer, the rise of Nazi Germany, and with lots of fun uh, audio bits and weaving in moments from interviews with a host of different Bonhoeffer scholars. And as a part of that, we're also for everyone that signs up to join the class at riseofbonhoeffer.com. There are long interviews with Bonhoeffer scholars that we'll be using in the class, along with regular live streams with Jeff and I, where um, we will, you know, be answering some questions, digging into what happens at those periods of time, and discussing some different reading selections from Bonhoeffer that kind of match as we're going through the journey of his life. And all that is really kind of hoping to introduce the complexity and that in a picture of Bonhoeffer, where it's not just this kind of like idealized hero at the end, and give and weave in the story of the German church struggle in the midst of Nazi Germany, where it's not just, oh, the Nazis are inherently bad at the very end. There was a whole story and these nuances where, as we learn, I think more and more about the details in his own life and the struggle of his time, it will hopefully enable us to let his own voice challenge and stir us in the present. And Jeff and I have been spending quite a bit of time on this for quite a while. So we're super excited to finally get to start sharing it with everyone. Um, and maybe a place to start, Jeff, is for you to just share a bit about your own relationship with Bonhoeffer, where it started, how we got here, and then we can, um, dig into some kind of, prefacorial type conversation.
Well, first of all, I want to say that because I've just installed Ting optic fiber in my house, I'm not sure why I keep dropping out, but it does say sometimes I'm disconnected and I'm reconnecting to you. So if that's a problem on my end and I drop out, I'll try to get back on post haste. So my interest in Bonhoeffer actually probably started when I was in college, and I had come back to college. Long story, but I had come back after dropping out and was a strongly evangelical orientation at that point in my life, part of the Jesus movement in the early 70s. And our chaplain introduced us to Bonhoeffer, and we were reading selections of letters and papers from prison, the later theological letters that Bonhoeffer writes in Letters and Papers from Prison. So, unlike a lot of people, that was my first introduction, and it intrigued me a little bit. But because I was 21 and looking for heroes, I was as much interested in the fact that Bonhoeffer was an early resistor to the Nazi regime. And even though I really didn't know much about him at all, my first exposure in that college class sort of led me to wonder about, well, who were the resistors? Who were the theologians of resistance to Adolf Hitler early on when it mattered? Who was resisting Hitler in 32 and 33? And I carried that into seminary at Wesley Theological Seminary, where there's a professor by the name of John Gotzi, who was a student of Karl Barth and studied in Switzerland with Barth. And from Gotzi, I sort of came to understand that there was another theologian besides Bonhoeffer, and that started me on a exploration of Karl Barth. And then in graduate school, when I went to do my PhD, I did a dissertation on Barth, um, and was not as involved with Bonhoeffer. But when I left graduate school and started teaching, I found that I returned to Bonhoeffer because, and I'm going to upset some Barth people who are on this. The more that I read of Barth, the less interested I became in him. The early Barth fascinated me. The Barth that resisted the Nazis fascinated me. But by the time I got to, I don't know, volume 3 of Church Dogmatics, I felt like I could kind of anticipate where things were going. So I turned to Bonhoeffer and said, well, there was another theologian of resistance. And I started studying Bonhoeffer, attending the Bonhoeffer Society. I gave a paper at the American Academy of Religion in which the Bonhoeffer scholars raked me over the coals, as they are wont to do sometimes. But I probably deserved it. And so that led to a lifelong interest in just finding out what Bonhoeffer was about. And when you become intrigued and you start digging into the complexities of him, it's a lifelong passion.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the you and I, obviously, when we became friends, we've got to work together in all sorts of different ways, and have done some other classes on Bonhoeffer. And when the idea first came up of doing something like this, that through the kind of audio documentary style is able to introduce a larger group of people to Bonhoeffer than kind of like the, I don't know, the nerdy gateways that normally happen when you and I hang out, and then have the kind of deeper theological reflection and the elements that are like, class focused. Part of why I really wanted to partner with you on this is that both the Bonhoeffer, but also that whole time period in the Nazis' rise in Germany, the church crisis and everything around it, ongoing wrestling with the Jewish question theologically, and then what does that look like for Christians today? Even in your own book on Bonhoeffer's concept of religionless Christianity, it's like what was being opened in some of these theological reflections towards the end of his life, like all of that is grounded in a lot of classroom time with students who are young adults and trying to figure out what in the world you do with God, what do you do with modernity after Auschwitz and such. And the kind of wisdom that happens when you get to read those texts and wrestle with those questions in the classroom is something I knew would be just a huge asset in trying to invite people into the story. Through all these different digital elements. So I'm interested in you sharing a bit about what did you learn in getting to wrestle with Bonhoeffer, and then the larger historical moment with students, and maybe like, how did that change over time as you got to return to it in the classroom context?
Yeah, interesting. So I think probably one of the most interesting things that took place in me, and the shift that took place in me, was a recognition that the things that I had been told about something like the confessing church are the basic narrative that I had gotten along the line of there were these few Christians that resisted Hitler, and they were courageous, and they stood up for right, and they protected the Jews. And I think, in fact, that got a little problematic the deeper into this I came. And because of that, I came to an understanding, a more, I want to say, accurate understanding of the situation of the church in 1932-33. The way that Christians in Germany had actually welcomed Hitler. And this will probably become a theme as we continue on through this class, and certainly through the video documentary that you and I are making. Um, that there was far more acceptance of Hitler among Christians than I had come to understand. You know, the narrative was Hitler overwhelmed the church, Hitler took over the church, Hitler intimidated the church because he was able to gain power so fast. He was able to gain power so fast. I'm going to suggest over the next few weeks, because the church gave it to him. Because in the moment in which Christians probably should have recognized what was on their doorstep, they, in fact, were unable to see it for what it was. And they were seduced by the claims that Hitler was going to overcome the shame of the Versailles Treaty, the humiliation of Germany after World War I, was going to overcome the decadence of the Weimar Republic, the nascent democracy that was trying to take root in Germany in the 1920s. That the church, in all of that, welcomed a voice that seemed to have moral clarity and also a kind of appeal to the restoration of Germany's greatness, Germany's fortune. Hitler did promise the Germans he was going to make Germany great again. That's just there. It's in the documents. So when I sort of started delving deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into this, I thought, you know, it's important for us to tell the truth in historical eras as far as we can, as much as we know, as much as we understand. And truth can be very elusive at times. But I wasn't disillusioned about knowing more. I just became more committed to, when I'm teaching, I need to make sure that all of the reality of this is present to my students. When I'm teaching, I need to make sure that they understand that there were failures of Christian faith, that there were people, and I'm just going to go ahead and say that I think about a third of German Christians followed Hitler right into the bunker. There were people that throughout the rest of their lives, even after they knew what was happening to the Jews, still continued to follow Hitler. As an ancillary to that, also, the more I studied, the more I became aware of a kind of Lutheran heritage in Germany that took the worst parts of Luther as inspiration for what they did to Jews in the 1930s and for the anti-Semitism that was part of the foundation of German culture at that time. And this is where it really becomes hard for Christians to sort of wrap their heads around that, in fact, anti-Semitism, Christian anti-Semitism, centuries in the making, millennia in the making, had also prepared the foundation so that when Hitler came along and appealed to it, Christians were ready to acquiesce. And when I started to think about the complicity of Christianity to the Holocaust, that was another part that became a very powerful shaper and influencer for how I was to understand how my faith is lived out into the world. You know, when I bring that to the classroom, then I want the students to get a larger historical perspective and a deeper grounding in the things that it is that shape us in the very core, even in the world that we live in today. The unspoken assumptions, the unquestioned sort of social constructs that we embrace as being true, but they might only be true in a particular social location. So with all those things coming together, then my time in the classroom with students was very rich. And all of this, I'm just going to go ahead and say this, get this out of the way. All of this came to the front fore when the Nazis came to Charlottesville in 2017. And some of us were committed to a nonviolent resistance in that moment. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. We were committed to a nonviolent resistance. And what really shook me to the core of my being on the day that they occupied the park, and our clergy line was sort of stretched out in front of them as a bearing witness to the fact that love, not hate, peace, not violence, was the way of Christ. Um, I was shaken to the core to hear chants of blood and soil, Jews will not replace us, um, emitting from this small southern university town. These cries were ringing out. And at that moment, Bonhoeffer acquired a particular visceral salience, um, something that I'd been studying and thinking about and reflecting on. And all I could think about was what he faced was so much worse than anything that we were facing on that particular day. He faced it in the entire culture. And God forbid that we ever have a culture that moves to that kind of fascism.
Yeah. And one of the things that in your description there, and something I think we're going to do a good job on throughout the whole project, is there is a kind of unmasking that's required to understand the soil in which the whole rise of the Nazis came in, and there's a kind of uh, um, kind of parsing of the history that actually enables a clearer look at the potential for human beings, the potential within the Christian tradition to become radically complicit in things, and the entire time tell its story where it's the hero. And it just seems strikingly obvious, right, to us as Americans years later, going, well, that was the wrong side of that, but that wasn't how it played out for so many people. And yet the German people at that time are not like an anomaly. um, they're part of the human species, where we have deep predicaments, and I think the the so often the desire to make the enemies, the Nazis, the big bad, and to make Bonhoeffer the perfect hero, then misses the moral complexity, and the genuine difficultness of faith in the face of something so ugly. Um, and I hope, you know, I think we're going to make our best effort not to do that. But with Bonhoeffer, much like with Jesus, there's a lot of different versions, and the kind of awe of Jesus has led to, well, I mean, there's millions of denominations at this point, uh, theological diversity, political like there's so much that has happened in the wake of Jesus. And then the same is true with Bonhoeffer. The number of Bonhoeffer moments we've had, right? The moment he becomes a hero, over and over. The last 50 years are replete with Bonhoeffer moments, with people kind of claiming the legacy, much like Christians claim the legacy of Christ. And sometimes you wonder where the dots get connected. And one of the things uh, that that often happens is Jesus and Bonhoeffer get nodded at, but never dealt with, and then we move on to how their legacy is being leveraged. And throughout this process, I wonder, uh, in your time wrestling with Bonhoeffer, like what's one of those places that you didn't anticipate discovering, that forced you to kind of like dwell, wrestle, tend to the reality of what was going on in his life and on the ground, that perhaps the idealized version that gets leveraged in the public square for a Bonhoeffer moment or such passes over.
Well, I mean, maybe not so much a struggle, but the realization that there are many Bonhoeffers, and that conservatives, liberals, people all along the theological spectrum can rightly claim inspiration in Bonhoeffer or find in Bonhoeffer justification even for maybe their own particular theology or their political philosophy. And part of this is because Bonhoeffer himself was always changing. Um, and then part of it was that, in some senses, Bonhoeffer himself was always a fairly conservative, um, I want to say law and order kind of guy. So, my conservative friends can find the other Bonhoeffer, the one that adheres to order, that thinks that after World War II, maybe not a democracy, but something akin to a benevolent dictatorship might be better for Germany. So in the political realm, I think that there are people that latch on to that particular Bonhoeffer. In the liberal realm, people, they also have ample um, theological and other perspectives to take from Bonhoeffer. So, for instance, the Bonhoeffer struggle with his relationship to Germany, with his relationship to his German identity, with his relationship to the sense of German patriotism. This looks very different to Bonhoeffer in 1928 when he's lecturing in Barcelona as a youth pastor. I want to go ahead and just throw that in there. As a youth pastor, than it does to Bonhoeffer in 1933 when he shows up on a radio broadcast that we'll talk about in our first episode of our podcast, where he is decrying the Fuhrer principle, the principle of the leader. And right out of the gate, 2 days after Hitler takes power, Bonhoeffer is speaking out against Hitler. So, in as much as our faith is always embodied and it's complicated and we find it colored and shaped and informed by the social location in which we found ourselves, I am going to say that one of the things that Bonhoeffer gave me in all of the struggling was the realization that faith, there is a particular perspective of faith that may not rest entirely on our social location, even if it is colored and informed by it. That we are able to step out of our particular perspectives and move into other people's perspectives. And he one at one point, you'll hear a lot about this over the coming weeks. The underside of history, or the perspective of the dispossessed, able to see the world with another set of lenses. And so the problematic part for me was realizing that Bonhoeffer is complicated. And if I try to latch on too firmly to one aspect of Bonhoeffer's life, I'm gonna miss the other parts.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like for instance, a little troublesome thing here. He's a very patriarchal, hierarchical thinker, and he never loses that. So you can see, for instance, why feminist theologians or even third world theologians, even Gustavo Gutierrez, comes to Bonhoeffer and says he never really entirely gives up his colonial mindset. And you can see some of this in Bonhoeffer. So there are always critiques to be made and always sort of revisions and understandings. And I guess the thing that's going to occupy us for the next several weeks is maybe balancing out the Bonhoeffer of history and the Bonhoeffer of faith.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be our journey to think about those and the way that those interact with one another.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I answered your question.
Oh, well, I mean, I I think so, because like, and here's one thing that I'd love for you to kind of just unpack a bit, so people get an idea of just how complicated it is with this tension of the Bonhoeffer of history and the Bonhoeffer of faith. That you see that same kind of divide, right, with Jesus. Is the the popularity of Bonhoeffer has generated uh, a significant gap between the person a lot of Christians meet when they meet Bonhoeffer, and the much more complex and nuanced conversation that Bonhoeffer scholars have, be it the volume of different kind of popular tellings, the way different writings have been edited for like discussion groups and such, the way he's so popular that he inspires people. But then you could confuse what Bonhoeffer was excited about with what the person that he, inspired him is orienting or like leveraging him for. Um, when you think of uh, the the difficulties of kind of digging in to kind of uncover and wrestle with the history of Bonhoeffer. Like, what's that been like as a guild? Compared to plenty of other of his compatriots. Like if it was Boltmann or Bart, or like think of other people in this context. There's not this popular imagination of him that's been leveraged in so many different ways to contend with. And so I'm interested from your perspective. So like part of what this project does is it's not just all the work we've done. We did interviews with all these different Bonhoeffer scholars and they're trying to give a kind of synthetic picture of Bonhoeffer scholarship in a way that it's receivable without having to go to graduate school and such. But can you describe that predicament for someone who is both deeply connected to the church and a part of Bonhoeffer studies within the academy?
Well, that's a complicated question. I'm not sure I can answer it, but I will say this: we don't have this discussion about Karl Barth because Barth wasn't martyred
Mm-hmm.
or Barth wasn't executed. We have this conversation about Bonhoeffer because essentially, for better or for worse, vast majority of people believe that Bonhoeffer was a Christian martyr. So he even shows up on the western wall of Westminster Cathedral in London, with the Christian martyrs. That's a discussion maybe for another time as to whether or not he was a martyr or whether he died as a result of his political activity, not his Christian one. I'm not sure you can separate those two out. But because of that particular legacy, then, and because of his, I want to go ahead and say, peripheral involvement in the plot to assassinate Hitler, and there were many, um, because of his involvement in that, he has become a certain kind of type. So that, for instance, if you want to claim the myth of redemptive violence, you can use Bonhoeffer as justification. See, he at the end of the day, he even gave up his pacifism because he knew that Hitler must be stopped. So this was exactly the argument that people were making with Saddam Hussein back in the Second Gulf War, um, that we must stop the tyrant. And look, stopping tyrants, who would? That sounds morally righteous. It sounds fairly clear. Who wouldn't want to do that? Um, there are people that will make the argument, and I think it's an interesting argument to make, that the plot to assassinate Hitler actually resulted in the death of more people than if it had not been undertaken and failed. Like I said, there were more than one, and that's an interesting argument and something that we can look at later. But I want to go back then to the question: if you take this particular human being in all of that complexity and you overlay that with the sort of sense of martyrdom, um, then what we find is a figure that does get used in a lot of different ways. The Bonhoeffer scholars that I'm aware of try to be very careful in nuancing their particular positions. So if they take what appears to be a liberal Bonhoeffer position, they're doing that on the basis of deep reading, of not just discipleship or not just letters and papers from prison, but a deep reading sermons and letters and in all other kinds of aspects of his life. And one of the things is that I don't think we'll ever come to any kind of agreement. I think we'll come to a better understanding of who he was in his historical context. But there's always going to be interpretations of Bonhoeffer.
Yeah, and like almost any figure you're wrestling with who is both historical and present, in the sense that that person and their story animates many in the present, it can get very complicated. Um, now, yesterday, Jeff, um, one person who wrote a large book on Bonhoeffer that sold a whole lot uh, went on a long riff about how our current moment in America is very similar to Bonhoeffer's. That included this line. So, I'm just interested in,
I have no idea what you're referring to.
I know. I'm gonna bet you can guess the Bonhoeffer scholar after I tell
Uh,
you this line.
Scholar would maybe not be exactly inaccurate.
Okay, somebody that wrote and talks about Bonhoeffer a lot said
And
this
and
line
loves, yeah, cares about Bonhoeffer.
a lot, a lot. This individual with the Bonhoeffer book, after comparing our current situation in the U.S. to Nazi Germany in the early 30s, says, "I promise you, if Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are elected, they are going to come after pastors and people of faith like you have never seen. Never seen." And like when the what this I mean, this comes up in like all of our conversations with Bonhoeffer scholars. There's like, oh, there's lots of Bonhoeffer. He changes his mind throughout. And like, if you look, you can see he's like this unfinished hero, and there are these different experiences where his vision of the gospel changes and grows, and then what responsibility looks like when he has a different understanding of how responsible the state may be, or the church may be, or then what's an individual to do. And there's this like tormented person is moving through history trying to figure things out as you go. And then there's this one. And um and like, what is it like to wrestle with a figure whose identity is so contested that one of the more popularizes of a mythological Bonhoeffer um, is like, we're in a Bonhoeffer moment, and if one party, if Kamala and Tim get in there, the state's going to come after us, just like the Nazis came after real Christians in Germany.
Yeah, so I come from the evangelical world. That I was shaped in my teens, early 20s. Um, that dropped away at some point after extensive study in church history, realizing that Christianity didn't start with me. Um, and so I'm just going to go ahead and say that there is a kind of persecution complex in my evangelical brethren, as it were, that unless they feel like they're being persecuted, they're not being real Christians. So they will find persecution where none exist. It's hard for me to see American Christians as being persecuted when people just don't agree with you, or the state does something that you don't like. If you were looking to the state for affirmation or confirmation of your faith, then you're looking in the wrong place. And I don't care if you're Democrat or Republican, you're not going to find it in the state. So that and let's just go ahead and say this particular person that you were talking about, at some point we'll have to name it. His initials are Eric Metaxas. Am I right?
You're a real sleuth there. You figured it out.
Yeah. He does have a particular understanding of Bonhoeffer that maps onto a particular understanding of Christian persecution in the modern world that runs distinctly against anything conservative. It's hard for me to imagine that if the levers of power in your particular country run through a fairly conservative judiciary. And so I guess I just have to say that is actually a misuse. And if you went back and you took a careful look in the context and the history of Germany, say in the 1920s and early 30s, I just don't think you would find warrant for a comment that if Harris Walz come into political power, that Christians are going to suffer this horrible persecution. Um, I just don't see that.
It
And I
would be
think
weird if
that,
the Lutheran vice president went around rounding up Lutheran ministers. You know,
well, and the Baptist president, for God's sakes,
yeah,
I
you're just
mean,
like,
you
like,
know, and see, at that point, then Bonhoeffer addresses the distortions of a Christianity that become um, captured in a cultural way to legitimate one's own particular party, whether it's political, whether it's religious, whatever it is. Um, that there's a certain sense in which that distortion or that betrayal of faith as a place where all are gathered at the table, all are welcome at the table, all means all, no matter what nationality, no matter the sexual orientation, no matter gender identification, no matter race, anything. Um, Once you move away from that kind of universality of grace, then you have moved into a foreign ideology. And
mhm.
Bonhoeffer names that several times in his writings.
Yeah, yeah, I know. In one of the interviews that are going to be part of this whole project, and everyone in the class that will get like the entire interview with different scholars, so you can hear everything they bring. And then in the audio documentary side, we're bringing in, like, instead of like footnoting, it's like you actually hear the scholar we would have footnoted telling us about their research and conclusions and such. Um, in my head, it's a great idea. It was gonna be a lot of fun. But one of the moments
We'll see.
when Lori uh, brings up, like, Bonhoeffer in this moment, right in the early 30s, and she's like, "Yeah, he got in a pulpit and said, you can be a nationalist and you can be a Christian. You just can't be both." Right. And Bonhoeffer's kind of clarity, despite like all the complications, he has this ongoing growth. But what the kind of like triggers this initial insight for him is the awareness that the call to discipleship, the lordship of Christ, um, is something that problematizes any kind of like deep sense that your ultimate identity is held by some other power or some other leader, or some other identity that holds your identity in a deeper way than the one of your baptism. And that runs throughout so much of Bonhoeffer's writings. Like, even by the end, when in religion, when he's talking about religionless Christianity and what happens in a world come of age and all that kind of stuff, you can, like, even there, there's this constant touchstone of that the follower of Jesus orientation is a supreme commitment to the way of Christ. And then you figure out what happens next. And some of that mean be setting side of things that you thought were essential, that were really just religion, or really just modernity, or really just your commitment to your nation or your culture. There's a kind of discernment that runs through his life that you see in action, right? You see transformations, but the ability to make an like declare the kind of idolatry that a anxious and turbulent time can generate, even in the church, I think is a really important feature.
Yeah. I don't know how to respond to that.
Well, I was
I
just,
lost you,
oh,
and now you're
sorry.
frozen.
You're not frozen for me. Um, one of the other, uh, let's see, one of the other elements I would say for Bonhoeffer, and you mentioned this, that your introduction was, right, letters and papers from prison. Mine was like at my college cousin gave me Cost of Discipleship, like in 7th or 8th grade. Uh, Gave me the book, and we were at Christmas in Texas with grandparents, and everyone went to bed. And we were there for a while, and I read the first 2 chapters of Cost of Discipleship on New Year's Eve. And when it gets to Bonhoeffer doing the, like, Christ bids you come and die, like, this is what, like, the allegiance to Jesus thing is a big deal. And I remember reading it going, oh, like, there's like there's like this whole nother depth to my identity as a follower of Jesus, a kind of seriousness and such that I hadn't kind of contemplated or reflected on until the kind of like energetic opening of that book seized me. Um, and since then, most Christmas vacations, I always read different things of Bonhoeffer and have this kind of like um, relationship where I check back in with him. So this whole process has been tons of fun, of like getting a lot deeper awareness of his history and his context and what's going on. And there are different things that came to the fore with this encounter with Bonhoeffer that were different than previous ones. And I wonder if you had any that come to your mind, like in be it the questions that are coming from our moment to Bonhoeffer or the things that showed up as we spent the last year getting ready for this. If there's anything in particular that kind of seized you.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Bonhoeffer always troubles me. Um, I don't, I've been studying him for decades now, and I don't feel like I have the handle. But one of the things that he always does challenge me with is his involvement in the conspiracy, his movement into the Abwehr. And I'm always challenged, and my Anabaptist sensitivities are always challenged by that. And as a Christian, um, how do I respond? How do I respond to the injustice and the suffering of others? How do I respond? Um, is it appropriate to fight back in resisting evil? And the one place where the conservative sort of embrace of Bonhoeffer is so strong is the one place that I struggle with the most. Because I ask myself that question. I look at something like Ukraine and I say, well, do they not have the right to resist oppression? As problematic as this will be for some of your listeners, I look at a place like Gaza and Israel. And I've been to Israel. I've spent a lot of time in Bethlehem. Well, not a lot, maybe 3 weeks. And I think about the Christians, the Palestinian Christians there, who have been deserted by Christendom. And I think about how does Bonhoeffer inform this? And maybe there isn't a way that Bonhoeffer does, but I do find myself sometimes thinking far more conservatively than I ever thought before about the way that we speak up for the suffering, not just with our lips, but with our bodies. And the one central aspect of Bonhoeffer that has sort of driven into the core of me is this notion of the suffering as being the one universal perspective of human existence. It transcends nationalisms, it transcends social location. Everybody suffers. And Bonhoeffer makes this a core of his theology, not just in Letters and Papers from Prison, but throughout his theology, an attentiveness to the suffering of the world. And so my struggle with Bonhoeffer comes in what would it mean then to be on the side of those who are suffering? If violence is not called for, but seems to be the only way out. And at that point, then I find myself less in judgment of Bonhoeffer as I used to sort of be, and more in an understanding of the kind of moral dilemma that puts us in as people of faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Even that view that you're talking about reminds me of that passage in 10 Years After where, let's see, I have the quote right here. It remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcast, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled, in short, from the perspective of the suffering.
So I guess then my question would be to American evangelical conservative folks like who listen to Eric Metaxas. So where are you placing yourself if the suffering of the world? I know you place yourself very strongly in a kind of perspective of birth, of natal protection, of fetal protection, but in the suffering of the rest of the society, where do you place yourself? I don't denigrate your moral um, sensitivities about protecting life, um, but then why does life become unimportant to you at some point? Why is not the feeding of hungry children, or the clothing of the poor, or the visiting the prison, to use somebody's saying? Why is that not morally important? Why is that not a place where the suffering of the world is the thing to which you should attend? And so then Bonhoeffer also challenges me to think about sort of the suffering of the world that releases me from my own ethnocentrism. What about the suffering of the others? What about the suffering of my brothers and sisters in other parts of the world, or either other parts of Charlottesville? And that's where Bonhoeffer can be very troublesome if you think about suffering as something more than just your own particular tribe.
Yeah. I think I've never um, read Bonhoeffer and thought he asked the correct question when he asked, "Are we of any use?" And near the end of his life, he asked the question, to his closest friends, "Are we still of any use?" After reflecting on, the where he's like, that's the bit where he talks about the huge masquerade of evil has thrown all ethical concepts into confusion. Evil appears like with a form of life, a light. Good deeds, historical necessity, social justice, all those things just become justifications for something that is blatantly evil. And when ethical concepts and commitments get oriented to justify evil, then what are the stewards of traditions of goodness and justice? Like, what are we of any use? Um, and he has that line that we've become silent witnesses of evil deeds, cunning and learned at the arts of obfuscation and equivocal speech. Unbearable conflicts have worn us down or made us cynical. And that kind of exasperation that you can hear in Bonhoeffer not long before he's arrested is one that um, feels much nearer to me now than it has in the past.
Yeah, no, I mean, discerning evil is probably one of the most important tasks that we have as Christians when we think about how is grace manifested, where is grace manifested, where is Christ made present. And in Bonhoeffer, this is always, as once again, as we'll learn in the ensuing weeks, the concrete life of human beings embodied in their particular spaces is where we need to have our discernment. So, you know, I find him very prescient or very wise. And you read it a minute ago, maybe you can read it again, where he understands that evil becomes cloaked in necessity. Well, this is the way the world is, and this is the way that we have to be. Um, who are the voices that call for us to give up our power to them? Who are the voices that call for us to just trust them that they will take care of everything without allowing us participation uh, in understanding how a society is arranged or organized? Who are the voices that are at work, not attending to the suffering, but attending to their own power? And one of the things that so bedevils us now is that the voices on the political spectrum each is claiming that the other side does this, that the other side is the oppressor. So for Christians today, what's so frustrating is to cut through the noise and ask yourself, you know, where is the truth of a thing? Because we're being swallowed up by lies. We're drowned in lies. So the goal is to never have us understand a truth or the truth of a thing at all in order that power can be maintained. And I think
Mhm.
Bonhoeffer, you know, in that 10 years after, or that's where you're reading those quotes from, right? I, that is such a rich text for, you know, he's writing this, I think, in is it 42? Is it the Christmas of 42? My memory, he's arrested in April of 43, I think. So at this particular point, he's looking back on this and he is trying to combat his cynicism. You know, he is trying to combat all that he's seen since 1933 when Hitler came into power.
Mhm.
And that's, you know, that so we are not Nazi Germany. I just want to go ahead and say this real quick. We're not Nazi Germany in 1932, 33. We are not going to be Germany. We have a different sort of polity, a different understanding, hopefully stronger resistance, although that's questionable at this point, to state power. Um, so, so I don't think that you can draw a direct line from one to the other, but I do think that there are family resemblances of what happens when political powers seek to acquire dominance, unchallenged dominance. I think what people fail to understand sometimes, because we've made Hitler such a fetish of evil, that in 1933 Hitler's just a politician that many of the elite in Germany thought was just a bumbling um, pretender, and they thought, well, we'll give him this power of chancellor or whatever, and we'll allow this, and then we'll control him. He wasn't Hitler in our imagination of how Hitler exists. He was he was just, you know, Adolf, uh, an ambitious politician with a rhetoric gift. And so it becomes very difficult for us to sort of realize that in 1933, uh, Christians were supporting him because the reality of that evil that masquerades that Bonhoeffer's talking about 10 years after is not apparent, but it's apparent to Bonhoeffer and it's
Mhm.
apparent to Barth. It's apparent to certain members of the confessing church. And I think that's what makes that this still, um, you know, some 80 years after, an important kind of place to think about, reflect upon, and study.
Mhm. Yeah. You know, one of the elements of Bonhoeffer's own thought that expands throughout his uh, uh, experience, but is kind of grounded from the very beginning, is his very Christocentric hermeneutic and the way in which the presence of Christ is the presence of the other. Um, and the going through all of his works in this process, the number of times there are quotes like this, and this is an early one, where he says, "There's no part of the world, no matter how lost, no matter how godless, that has not been accepted by God in Jesus Christ and reconciled to God. Whoever perceives the body of Christ in faith can no longer speak of the world as if it was lost, as if it were separated from God. They can no longer separate themselves in clerical pride from the world." Right? There's always this sense that the incarnation, the event of Christ, has oriented the followers of Christ towards the other, precisely as being oriented towards Christ. Like that Christ is for the world, and to to be faithful to Christ is to meet them, and that impulse takes. Well, at least the most challenging passage for me in the last 6 or so months has been there at the end where he's talking about contempt for humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that the danger of allowing ourselves to be driven to contempt for humanity is very real, right? And he's
Mm-hmm.
talking, looking here, Hitler's war's going. He's getting letters from former students at the underground seminary that were forced into service of all the horrors on the Eastern Front. And he's asked,
That
are
they're
we of any?
participating in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's like, the temptation is to have contempt for the people that are enabling and making this whole thing possible. And he said, we know very well that we have no right to let this happen, this contempt, and that it would lead us into the most unfruitful relation to human beings. Well, when he says this as someone who very much is tempted regularly to have contempt towards the other on the other side of powerful political situations, where the poor, marginalized, and disenfranchised are being used as pawns, that temptation's there. And he says, the following thoughts may protect us against this temptation. Through contempt for humanity, we fall victim precisely to our opponent's chief errors. Whoever despises another human being will never be able to make anything of him. Nothing of what we despise in another is foreign to ourself. We must learn to regard human beings less in terms of what they do and neglect to do, and more in terms of what they suffer. The only fruitful relation to human beings, particularly to the weak among them, is love, and that is the will to enter into and keep community with them. God did not hold human beings in contempt, but became human for their sake. And when we reread that early in this process, I have reread it so many times since then, because the temptation to have contempt for people who you see as the other side of a stand for good. It's like Bonhoeffer sitting there going, hey, Tripp, Jeff, did you know that while you were God's own enemies, God gave God's very own self for you? And if God has chose to no longer be God without us, even God's own enemies, then can you describe a future for your faith, for your country, for a world without the image bearers that God has chosen? And that's hardcore. You know what I mean? Like I I'm like thinking back to that very first moment of reading Bonhoeffer as a middle schooler. And he's like, when Jesus bids you come and die, come on. This is some costly grace stuff. Take this seriously. There at the end, where he's just exasperated, seeing this failure, having contempt, in all this kind of stuff. And he goes, but remember, while we were yet sinners, and remember that Christological hermeneutic, that it's above the pay grade of us to put someone in a category that God's refused to put them in. That is a challenge, and I'm definitely not good at it.
So there was a book that came out, Lori and her husband uh, co-edited, on Bonhoeffer's political theology. Bonhoeffer and resistance, political theology, Bonhoeffer. So I had a chapter in there on Bonhoeffer in Charlottesville, and the quote that you just read factors into this, because as I was standing there on the line and I was hearing chants of faggot priest, and then at one point when we went to occupy the steps leading into the park and were knocked around, I don't know which group it was, I found myself experiencing that contempt in a visceral way, not in an academic setting, but if I just had a bloody stick, I'd beat somebody if I could get to them right now. That's the way that in the moment you feel. Um, and so I had that visceral reaction, and I kept coming back to that quote, that actual quote by Bonhoeffer, that my contempt for the humanity that was assaulting me was, I don't want to say evil, but was not redemptive. And that the moment that I put that person outside the bonds of grace, then I myself was in danger of not understanding grace.
Yeah. Well, um, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I'm y'all are all going to discover how lucky I've been to get to work with Jeff on this project as we go through it. And hope those of you that haven't gone to riseofbonhoeffer.com and signed up, you feel the lure to come do so, so we can hang out together, read some Bonhoeffer, wrestle with it, get to know a bunch of Bonhoeffer scholars, and know that underneath of it, a big element of this is how that Bonhoeffer also is, a friend in Jeff and I's head, that we've been working our own faith out by having conversations with him. And while the kind of sanitized, hyper saintly version of Bonhoeffer might not be the real one, I have found more inspiration from discovering more about the unfinished hero, who learned to be honest about his own frailty, complicity, and wrestled with the presence of Christ, even before those he had contempt from, and that is something I hope everyone gets a chance in the process of going through this to do. Any
So I
final
just want to
words there,
jump in
Jeff?
here
Yeah.
with a little teaser. With a little teaser.
Ooh, a teaser.
So if we think about Bonhoeffer and we think about Christianity as a cultural possession, both of those is a cultural possession, then I have to say, a couple of weeks ago, I decided I'd really read Project 2025. So I did. My initial reading was a lot closer than my later reading when I started scanning. When I lost Bonhoeffer and Cheap Grace in the introduction to Project 2025, mind blown. Because if that was Bonhoeffer's understanding of cheap grace, then I have not understood Bonhoeffer at all. So if that intrigues or makes our community of learners interested, it's found in the introduction, and maybe it will shock you as much as it shocked me. But this goes to show how Bonhoeffer is used, right? How he's employed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there we go. We'll see you all again soon. riseofbonhoeffer.com is where you sign up. Feel free to invite your friends and such. The class is donation based, including $0. When you're on the donation page, you can't donate $0 because that would not be an actual donation. But if you hit the cancel button, you'll find out you've already been sent the welcome email. You get sent it before you even do the donation thing. But if you hit cancel or return, it'll tell you all the detailed instructions. If people signed up and missed anything, class info at homebrewedchristianity.com is the email address, and David will help you out and make sure everything, that you get everything. And throughout the process, as you listen to audio documentary, do the readings, join us for chats and all that kind of stuff, at any point you respond to class emails with questions or topics for discussion, they'll get put in a nice little Google Doc, organized so we can make sure the topics and questions that come in most frequently, we'll make sure we tackle those. And if you don't want your question read directly, feel free to put that in there. But yeah, I'm very honored to get to do this with you, Jeff. Excited to introduce everyone to a bunch of our fellow scholars who have spent much of their career wrestling Bonhoeffer.
Well, I just want to say, after listening to the first rough draft of the podcast, it's pretty amazing what technology can do.
Yes. Quite excited. It's turned out really good. So, thank you all for being here, and we'll be back soon.